We're very lucky to have as our first guest on Classics Confidential, Dr Phil Perkins. He's a senior lecturer in the Open University. Can you tell us a bit about what you've been working on?
I work mostly on the Etruscans, who are the people who lived in Italy before the Romans. So that's during the first millennium BCE, between about the 9th century and the 1st century.
Did they live all over Italy?
Well, that's an interesting question. Mostly they lived in the central part of Italy, on the western coast, in the area to the north of Rome, traditionally between the River Tiber and the River Arno. So that's the modern areas of Lazio and Tuscany. But they did expand beyond those areas into Campania, that's the area around the Bay of Naples, and also northwards across the Apennine Mountains into the valley of the River Po.
How many Etruscans were there? How big was the population?
Well, people have tried to answer that question by adding up the number of farms we know, the number of villages we know, the number of cities we know, and making estimates of how many people lived in each one. But obviously it's a very hazardous way of calculating it. But it's thought that they're big cities, of which there were around about 12 to 15, would have had somewhere between 10 and 30,000 people in them. So if we do a bit of multiplication, we get to at least 500,000. But it's very difficult to know an answer to that kind of question, because we don't really have enough detail about how many people there were in those times to answer that kind of question.
Okay.
But if you were to say somewhere between 1 million and 100,000, you'd probably be right.
That's a lot of Etruscans.
Well, yes, but there's also a lot of uncertainty as well.
And what can you tell us that's interesting or unusual about the Etruscans?
They're all dead. But the most unusual thing about the Etruscans, and this is a thing that they were noted for in the ancient world anyway, is their language, because their language is completely different to every other language that was spoken or is spoken in the Mediterranean or in Europe. It's unlike all the other languages in the Mediterranean, which are known as the Indo-European languages, which are all related to one another and originated in the area of the South Asia many thousands of years ago. But the Etruscans speak something completely different. The vocabulary is different, the grammar is different, every structure of the language is different. Its nearest relations, and they're not very close, are Finnish and Hungarian. Yes,
wow.
Finnish, which is a bit unusual, isn't it? But even then, it's not very closely related.
Can you tell us any Etruscan words?
Well, there's some actually that are thought to be the origin of words that we have in our current language. One of them is fersu, which is a word that we think we know meant fersu, P-H-E-I-S-U, which we think means actor, and it's the root of our common words persona.
Oh, right.
And there are other words, for example, the Etruscan, the word satellite in English is thought to derive from Etruscan, but most of these words that we think do come from Etruscan have actually come to us via the Latin language.
Okay.
So the Romans adopted the words into their own language, because they didn't have their own words for them, for example, loan words as they're called, and then from there they've come down into contemporary English.
So how do people explain this fact that the Etruscans had a language that was completely different to all their neighbours?
Yeah, well, there are two basic ways of explaining this. One is that they came from somewhere completely different to Italy, where a different language was spoken, and they brought that language with them. But the problem with that is you then have to identify somewhere else where that different language was spoken, and that has so far proved rather difficult to do. Although there are some people who will suggest that there are some other lost languages in the northwestern part of what is current Turkey, around the area of ancient Troy, that may be an origin. But a more popular or a more generally accepted answer is that they actually speak the remnants of a language that was formerly spread wider across the Mediterranean area back in the Neolithic period, in the New Stone Age, and that because of subsequent changes, the Etruscans are the only people who continued speaking that language, while others around them came and brought in different languages, the Indo-European languages like Latin, for example, or Greek.
And I know you've been doing some work on what recent kind of DNA discoveries how they can help us with that problem. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, it's interesting really because the problem of where the Etruscans came from and who they are is one that's been a problem for at least 2,500 years. So it's a nice old problem. It's about time someone managed to solve it. And the basic problem goes back to a Greek author, the first historian we know about, called Herodotus, who wrote down a story in the 5th century BC telling us that the Etruscans came from Asia Minor, from the area known as Lydia, which is in southwest Asia Minor. And everybody else in the ancient world agreed with his story, and it's written out in detail. I won't repeat it here. But anyway, they had to leave because of famine and such like, and they ended up in Italy. Only one other ancient author disagrees with him, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who was writing much later in about the time of Augustus, in about 9 BC. And he tells us that they actually came from Italy. So there were these two different possibilities. But it's never been really solved as an issue. Most archaeologists now will tell you that they come from Italy and they've always lived in Italy. They didn't migrate from anywhere else. That's because their material culture, the finds that you make, their pottery, their metalwork, etc., are unique to Italy. It's not as if you find them somewhere else, and you certainly don't find them in Western Turkey. And you can trace back their roots in material culture through the archaeology back into the Iron Age and the Bronze Age in central Italy. So they appear to have a continuity with the people before them.
But doesn't it look like some of their material culture might come from further east, say?
Well, there are aspects of their material culture which have similarities with other pieces of material culture from
but it's
the
not
East.
Enough to kind of support a hypothesis.
It's more part of a general pattern that spreads over the Eastern Mediterranean, in that people around Greece and Turkey adopt artefacts that have Eastern styles, as known as the Orientalizing period. And having Eastern style artefacts isn't enough to say they came from the East, because you could say the same about the Greeks and other people in Turkey, for example. So in itself it's not sufficient. But into this sort of long-running problem of who are the Etruscans, why are they different, has come molecular biology. And some scientists in Italy, from the University of Ferrara and also from the University of Pavia, have sampled blood from modern Tuscans and analysed it for its genetic makeup, particularly the mitochondrial DNA, which is the DNA transferred from mother to daughter.
So the people who lived in the same area that the Etruscans once inhabited.
That's right. It's the modern inhabitants of the area where the ancient Etruscans used to live. So I'll call the modern inhabitants the Tuscans from Tuscany, but the ancient ones are the Etruscans. Obviously the word's related, but they're kind of, you have to keep them separate in your mind.
And these scientists, did they just go around and find volunteers or people who thought they might have had family links?
Well, it's a bit difficult to prove you've got family links to people who lived 125 generations ago. But what they did is, first of all, they only took samples from people who can trace back their family trees for 3 generations in the same place.
Right.
So they're not people who've just come into Tuscany in, say, the last
'Cause that would be
100
pointless,
years, roughly. So they're not people who have been there for some time. And the other thing they try to do to control the origin of the people who they were sampling is to go to areas of Tuscany that they consider to be backwaters. So areas where they think the population has been stable for a long time. So they went to the middle of nowhere as much as possible. And they also took samples from close to a well-known Etruscan site called Murlo, which was an Etruscan site that is very famous because there's been some long-running American excavations there. And they thought this might increase the possibility that there would be Etruscan genetic material still in the contemporary population. There were very big problems with that, though, because the Etruscan site was actually abandoned in the 1st century BC. So, and then things have obviously happened subsequently in the medieval period. It was the seat of the Bishop of Siena. It's his summer palace in the town, so there's all sorts of possibility of other people coming in during the period. But
so were a lot of their subjects from this place, Merlo?